Hello and welcome to the Big Technology Podcast, a show for cool-headed, nuanced conversation of the tech world and beyond. And today we're coming to you live from World Summit AI, so it's a little bit different from our traditional recording. But everybody listening on the line, it's going to sound as usual, hopefully. And if you're watching live at the summit, it's great to be with you. And just know we're going to segue to a couple of ad breaks, but don't be alarmed. We'll actually insert the ads when we actually put the recording together. So this will just go ad-free for you. And for people who are listening on your podcast app of choice, please enjoy the advertising breaks. Joining us today is a very special guest, someone who I've been hoping to speak with for a while, and I'm very excited to get a chance to speak with her. It's Meredith Whittaker. She's the co-founder of the AI Now Institute, a former Google employee who founded Google's Open Research Group, and the Mindru Research Professor at New York University. Meredith, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. Really happy to be here.
So let's get started with the social dilemma. Actually, the way this interview came about is that I conducted an interview with Tristan Harris, talking a little bit about the criticisms of the social dilemma movie. And then my mentions filled up with folks saying, hey, why are we asking Tristan? Why don't we, ask some folks who have been critical of these things for a long time? And your name was mentioned, and that's what brought us together. And I'm thrilled to be able to, to speak with you about this stuff. And I think the social dilemma really is, on many levels, a criticism of the attention economy today, which people might say, talking a little bit about how algorithms at Facebook and Google, will end up inflaming tensions and keeping us locked to our screens. And the business model ultimately is bad for humanity. So though we're going to be talking a little bit about the social dilemma, this will be new material for folks listening in on the podcast, and hopefully for people out here at the conference as well. So let's begin talking a little bit about it. It seemed like your perspective is a little bit different from Tristan's. You're both ex-Google employees, but I'd love to hear what your take is, on the film and its main message, and where you think it may have gone right and gone wrong.
Great. Yeah, and I will start this by kind of a high level framing, which may echo some of the comments you saw in your mentions. I think one of the significant weaknesses with the film was that it sidelined and didn't give a platform to a lot of the people who have been researching and calling out these issues in, frankly, often more nuanced ways for a very long time. So there are folks like Safiya Noble, Sarah Roberts, Ruha Benjamin. I'd look at Black women like Inasa Crockett and Sadet Harry, who were sort of in 2014 and before calling out racist trolls that were sort of germinated from message boards like 4chan. And there are a lot of people who've actually been looking at some of the issues that are produced through and amplified through social platforms and the consolidation of power that is now represented in a handful of tech firms. So I think, that was one of the primary issues. And along with that erasure, it erased some of the fundamental harms, the way in which a lot of these platforms and these algorithmic systems reproduce and amplify histories of racism, histories of misogyny. Who bears the harms of this type of targeted harassment, or the way in which algorithms represent our world, as Safiya Noble has shown so brilliantly, and who frankly reaps the benefits. And a lot of the people who were being interviewed were people who skipped from the side of reaping the benefits, right, working at a tech company, which I certainly did, to being kind of critics of this technology. But a lot of the criticism was drawing very heavily on this earlier work, which I think, I would love to see a number of these people on your podcast, and I would love to see these critiques kind of enriched with some of those perspectives.
Yeah, and Tristan made the argument, he definitely addressed this in the show I did with him, and he made the argument that since it was these people who had built the software in the beginning, it was going to be a powerful device when you started to show visually the fact that these were the people who had actually, gone on and built it, and now they were saying what we've built is a bit of a Frankenstein, and that's what makes the film powerful. So I'm curious what you think about his defense from that standpoint.
Sure. I think that is an argument, but it doesn't obviate the fact that those are the people receiving a platform, that a lot of people who are first kind of learning about some of these issues are learning it from that perspective, and that the voices you raise up, the people you represent, matter a lot in these debates, right? And that
Right.
there was a lot of prior art, frankly. This is not, these are
Hmm.
not a brand new set of problems that just sort of occurred to folks, right? There's been decades of work and inquiry around these problems that was largely ignored, dismissed, or considered sort of, that's the byproduct, the externality of ultimately positive disruption, right? And it wasn't really taken seriously until, wealthy white men, frankly, in Silicon Valley began to feel some of the effects themselves.
Yeah, I definitely see that criticism. I think it's fair. Let's get to the argument itself. What did they miss? I think you mentioned there wasn't enough of a focus on the victim and enough of a focus on who's going to get rich from this stuff. I did think that they did a decent job. And, I mean, in the previous show I did with Tristan, it wasn't all, one big hug. There was definitely, I think that we went through the criticism of the film a lot. And now I guess like in our discussion, maybe I'll, play the other side. But like there was a discussion of the rise of nationalism. There was a discussion of the rise of isolation and loneliness and polarization in our society. So what did they miss in terms of a byproduct of these algorithms, of these social media platforms, in terms of who they're hurting? What did they look over?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll highlight a couple of things that I think are really important in any analysis of sort of tech and its social implications. And the first thing that really troubled me was this persistent picture of these types of technologies, these social media feeds, the kind of algorithmic systems that help to curate and surface some of this content, et cetera, as almost superhuman, right? You heard phrases like can hack into the brainstem, right? Things that really paint this as a feat of superior technology. This is innovation has reached a point and now it's turned on us, right? And we are but these lizard-brained plebeians who are now bearing the consequences of this tech. And I think that ignores the fact that a lot of this isn't actually the product of innovation, right? It's the product of a significant concentration of power and resources. It's not progress, right? It's the fact that we all are now more or less conscripted to carry these as part of interacting in our daily work lives, our social lives, as being part of the world around us, and that's only increased during COVID. I think this ultimately perpetuates a myth that these companies themselves kind of tell that this technology is superhuman, that it is capable of things like hacking into our lizard brains and completely taking over our subjectivities. And I think that that also paints a picture that this technology is somehow impossible to resist, that we can't push back against it, that we can't organize against it, right? I think and I think that's a real problem, because it does sort of put us in the position of being these sort of these kind of doughy subjects who are incapable of resisting, and that again I think there's much more to the story.
Right. I want to narrow in on your argument a little bit, because on one hand, you mentioned that these are a product of power. I mean, let me see if I can extrapolate, right? Saying that like we have to hold our phone, we have to be attached to our computers because that's what, the corporate structure today make us do. Like we need to be, available 24/7. And then there's an ability for us to organize and push back, as people, to say, maybe this isn't exactly what we want. Is that, am I getting it right? Is it the fact that like, when you think about power, there are corporations that are having us use these devices, and our ability to organize is something we should be thinking about more of, or am I off on that?
I mean, I think when I think about power here, I'm taking kind of a historical materialist analysis, right? I'm looking at these firms, right, as these sort of centers of almost improbable power at this case. And we have about five, companies in the Western context that are dominating kind of this, kind of big tech, as we call them, right? And these firms are a product of the kind of commercialization of computational network infrastructure, so the internet, and the product of kind of the development of advertising technology and other other sort of platform services that allowed them to gain a massive foothold with infrastructure, massive data collection pipelines that, anyone who carries this is continually contributing data, often to
Hmm.
all 5 of these companies and
And that's a
hundreds
phone
more.
for our listeners at home. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Holding
this
up a
is
phone.
for the people not
Yeah.
watching the video. I was holding up my cell phone, my Android.
Uh,
And so, we have to look, these companies represent extraordinary powers over our lives, not magical, right? That power is reflected in their ability to, to give away platforms for education to all of our school districts, right? To replace other sort of social fora, right? Instead of, having the debate on CNN, we have the debate on, YouTube now, to begin to become the spaces for our commerce, for our sociality, et cetera, and to then financialize and commodify those, those roles in that ecology. So I think it's,
I,
we need to also analyze kind of the material power that these firms have, and and look a little bit more closely at how these technologies work.
okay, but how do you suggest people push back? Like, for instance, if we were to, form a movement to say we don't want Google in the educational setting, is that really going to change the way that we're, often addicted to our phones and, start to dehumanize one another when we're looking at arguments and memes on the internet, which these algorithms incentive us to spend so much of our time on? So is there really a meaningful way that people can organize and actually change this reality versus, having the platforms dictate to us and try to put a spotlight on that issue so we're at least aware of it?
I mean, that's already happening across the U.S. and beyond. You look at, sort of efforts like Sleeping Giants, right, that have deplatformed a lot of, racist kind of hate speech on these advertising platforms. You look at the genesis of San Francisco's facial recognition ban and the community organizing that went into that, right? There's a school district in Lockport, New York, upstate, where parents organized after learning that facial recognition was going to be used by the school, justified by security concerns, and the parents ultimately won there. So across the board, we see kind of organizing around the kind of intrusion of these technologies and these sort of, power asymmetries that these type of surveillance technologies and tracking and monitoring and assessment technologies are exacerbating. So I think, there's organizing at the community level. There is also organizing within these tech companies. I was someone who participated a lot in labor organizing within Google and sort of in solidarity with folks organizing within other companies, right, who were pushing back both against working conditions in these companies, but also against pushing back against some of the business decisions that were being made, what we saw as unethical, immoral decisions to apply the technical capabilities that Google had to things like the U.S. military's drone program, for instance. So there's a ton of organizing, and in the case of the drone program, the Maven program, we won, right? Google backed off that contract and backed off the JEDI contract, which was sort of a larger infrastructure project that they were aiming for at that time. And I could go on with sort of lists of this type of pushback. But of course, that pushback is predicated on understanding that you can push back, right? That this technology is not sort of, so beguiling, so overwhelming, so superhuman that, we are but kind of, whatever it is, like completely incapable of
Right.
of resisting it.
I see. Okay. So when you talk about the fact when we're going to criticize tech companies, we shouldn't fall into a trap saying we don't have any recourse, to try to push back against some of the things they're doing, because there are real ways for people to stand up and say, hey, even though I'm a user of this app, maybe I'm not on the inside, I can change the way that they operate if I exert the power that I have.
Yeah, I absolutely think that is true. Yes, we need to recognize that we have the power to push back, and not feel so completely overwhelmed or outmatched, because in fact that's not the case. I think another thing that the framing in the film does is significantly ignore the massive amount of hidden labor that is required to maintain these sort of platform systems, right? And I'm thinking right now of the work of Lily Irani and Sarah T. Roberts, who've, for over a decade looked at, content moderators, right? Mechanical Turkers, the people who have to label the data, which is, that is simply necessary to create machine learning models, which is what we call AI at this point, right? The people who have to go through reports of abuse and often in, extraordinarily traumatizing circumstances, determine whether something is a violation of policy. There's actually no way to operate these platforms without that layer of, almost universally precarious, low paid, and, often thankless and damaging work. So again, in painting these technologies as the product of, a couple of genius minds who, just happen to have an idea that shifted all of humanity, we're ignoring that, and we're ignoring the kind of material dependencies on which these tech companies rely.
Right, but despite some of the protests, like this stuff really persists in a big way. So I wonder if you think there is a real chance. Are we just at the beginning here of the pushback that we're going to see from ordinary people against the platforms, or is there, or is this sort of a limit that we're seeing right now in terms of, yes, facial recognition initiative might have been defeated and in one instance, and some other victories are here and there, but there is like the real factor to deal with, which is the fact that these companies are so massive, and how much power does this sort of grassroots activism actually have when it comes to challenging these companies?
Well, I think there are many ways to challenge these companies, and I don't we're not talking about like a couple of scrappy grassroots groups, right? We're talking about organizing, and I think this is another issue with the film, right? It touches on issues of radicalization and kind of has this like hokey story about this boy who gets stuck on a news feed, and then he's at this rally that looks kind of QAnon, who knows, right? And it makes the case implicitly that, again, like our weak lizard brains just can't resist authoritarianism, right? Like there's something irresistible about hate speech, that if we see it on our news feed enough times, we're like drawn to a QAnon rally somehow. And I think that's fairly insulting, right? That certainly doesn't happen to all of us, and I don't want to discount the fact that there really is, like, YouTube is, we used to call it CNN for Nazis inside Google, right? Like there is a real problem with, well, myself and my friends, right? Yeah. There's a real problem we're dealing with, but the problem is not that like authoritarianism is just like naturally catnip to our brains, right? Again, that's almost like kind of elevating these hate-filled views to a level of power that they don't naturally have. I think it ignores that there's actually a very, very well organized movement on the far right that's very, very well financed, right? Like look at Mercer money, look at Bannon's organizing, internationally, look at the forces that are sort of instrumenting this technology to get this message out. But this is not something that, this technology has just found a kind of formula to hack our brains. There is organizing on the far right that has been instrumenting these technologies. And I think, at this point in the point I'm making, we need to get into like what work the anti-conservative bias trope is doing, and the way in which sort of the threat of regulation from the far right in the US government is being used to kind of, to basically threaten these companies that if they do deplatform hate speech, if they do take issues of sort of, hate and white supremacy on their platform seriously, they will be regulated.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in the third segment here. So taking a step back, it does seem like, I heard from so many people who don't talk, about tech, whether it's just like, folks who are like, oh, you do this, you should watch this movie. People who know that I report on Facebook and Twitter and say, hey, what do you think about the social dilemma? It does seem like it's brought these problems, into a broader consciousness within the world. I'm curious if you think it's a movie that did, more good than harm, or more harm than good.
I would consider myself someone who's like a little bit disconnected from that, because I just live with these questions, right? Like I don't know that I'm the best litmus test on that question, and I haven't, I do know that it's certainly, it's top 10 on Netflix. That means it's getting a lot of airtime, right? But I haven't, I haven't spoken with someone who doesn't think about these issues around like, what was it that you saw there, right? What was the argument that was being made? And again, I think certainly kind of raising issues with the way in which the consolidated power of tech corporations is operating within our social institutions and in our lives is that's great, right? But I do I'm not somebody who generally thinks like, well, just throw an unnuanced argument at the wall and that's better than nothing, right? I would want to understand what people were kind of taking away from it. And I also, I tend to feel that people are sort of smart enough to deal with nuance. So I do think there's room for, a number of follow-ups there.
Yeah.
So hopefully
I think
that's what happens.
definitely.
It's kind of a gateway to.
Yeah, it's good we're having these conversations. The people who were involved in the film, some of them said, well, we had to make it palatable for a broader audience, so we had to skip over some things, which I don't really like. I do agree with you that there is appetite for nuance, but it definitely got us talking here today and has people talking all over, and I think that's probably a good thing. Okay, we're going to head right to break and come back with a little bit of more of a discussion about the activism that you touched on and sort of what's happening or what happened inside Google and where it goes today. All right, we'll be back in a moment after this on the Big Technology Podcast here at the World Summit AI. And we're back on the Big Technology Podcast with Meredith Whittaker, a former Google employee who founded Google's Open Research Group. And we're talking at the World Summit AI. The first part of this discussion, we talked a little bit about the Social Dilemma movie, which again tends to blame algorithms and the business model for big technology companies for all the world's problems. I think we did a good job discussing that with a bit more nuance, talking about where that film could have been better. Now I want to talk a little bit about, drill down and talk a little bit more about your activism inside Google, Meredith, because, as a reporter watching this from the outside, I had been speaking to folks and it was always clear that, you had played a pretty central role in what happened inside the company. Now you can take a look a little bit at, with the benefit of hindsight, you did say you were retaliated against and then ended up leaving the company. We can get into that. But now you've been out of Google for a bit. Do you think this activism worked inside the company? What does it mean that you're not there anymore in terms of whether it will persist?
Yeah, I certainly think it works, right? But I don't, again, I don't frame that type of organizing as having a goal and then subsiding, right? The goal was both to push back against unethical, immoral business decisions and
and those decisions, just for the benefit of the audience, I think we were talking about use of AI in warfare, the decision to pay out $90 million to someone who was accused of sexual harassment, and then there was we talked about military, we talked about that.
And there was it was all of those things. I think and the inequitable treatment of the contract
laborers
and temp workforce, which made up more than half of our colleagues, but were not afforded the privileges of full-time work that you think about when you think about the glorious tech company workforce.
Right. And the scorecard on that was they ended up not renewing the contract with Maven. I don't think I think that people who were also accused of misbehavior inside Google were not awarded payouts. They were sort of summarily fired. And then the laborers, I think the laborers is still an open question, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, they changed some policies in the right direction, resistantly. And this is again, this is an ongoing struggle. This isn't something you win once by changing executives' minds because they finally see the light, right? This is, again, we're dealing with capitalist logics, and capitalist logics dictate that ultimately the objective function, to use an AI term, of any firm is continued revenue growth, exponential growth forever over time, right? These kind of impossible goals that we're beginning to question more and more as we see sort of the fragility of the planet we live on and the harm that type of operation in the world has done in so many ways. But beyond that, I think we need to continue to that type of organizing is meant both to win these specific goals, right? We want to make sure that all of our colleagues have, a dignified job, are not sleeping in their cars, right? Are making a living wage, have healthcare, and that we erase these sort of, two-class worker system, right? We really want to do that because that's justice now. While doing that, we also want to build the sort of collective muscle to gain the power to make these decisions ourselves, right? To have a more collective decision making and not leave these to a handful of people at the very top whose duty is to the board, whose duty is to shareholders, who ultimately are sort of calibrating their decision making around those capitalist incentives.
Right, but I also want to talk about who's going to make the decisions inside the company. I think laborers, that's something we could both agree on. They should be paid more and treated better. There were some other, there were some more controversial protests, or there were some protests over some more controversial issues inside Google. For instance, like the funding of the Conservative Political Action Committee conference in Washington, D.C. And then there have definitely been debates over Maven and whether it makes sense for tech companies to work with the military. So I wonder, like, the employee activism definitely takes a certain political bent, and the leaders of the companies obviously have theirs. But we talked about how these are very powerful companies, and shouldn't we have like a more democratic type of way of deciding what these companies should do from much more from doing when they actually implement these policies that have a big impact on the world? What do you think about that? Like, should it be in the hands of this one group of employees?
No. And especially when you're looking at the outside power that a company like Google has, right? The type, it's staggering to think about how much extraordinarily intimate information that company has about billions of people, literally, right? This is, this is, rooms full of Stasi dossiers on each one of us, right? And it's staggering to think about the way in which that company is able to use that data, that information to, create AI models, to create other services that are then sort of, making determinations in ways throughout our social institutions, right? So there's two levels on which I think, we really need to take this power seriously and recognize, the risks there. And certainly what I'm not suggesting is that, a handful of, 100,000 or 200,000 people in the world should be the arbiters of all of those decisions. But, part of the work we were doing organizing was also building, whistleblower networks, right? Beginning to build the connective tissue with other social movements so that, we could kind of organize in ways that hinted at that type of democratic decision making that is ultimately going to be, extraordinarily necessary to, create or recreate technology that could serve the public interest. But I agree with you that the goal is not just build this sort of hermetically sealed workplace democracy at Google, right? Especially given the issues with representation, the issues with misogyny and racism at that company, right? We don't want just a larger collection of the same people making those decisions, but that the politics of that was to open up the space for at least more collective discussion and decision making, and ultimately the goal would be to sort of link with social movements and take a lead. And I think the No Tech for ICE movement is one example where you saw tech workers across the industry sort of taking the lead of people who do immigration policy, immigration advocacy, on the U.S. southern border, and really understand the context and what it means to be, kind of hunted and tracked by this technology, communicating that to the people who don't have that experience, but may have an understanding of how these systems work, to build a campaign that is then pushing back against the companies who are provisioning those types of systems to ICE.
Yeah, and I'm going to get back to a little bit of the political activism, but I want to just do a quick digression one, because you mentioned the Stasi dossiers. Can employees at Google just access basically all your, go into someone's personal information and access it? So elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the dossier. Is it simply somebody being represented? So it's someone being represented by numbers and, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who can access different parts of that, right? And it's not in that, I'm using that as a metaphor because it's more easily graspable than the different shards of a database where different parts of that information that may not even be identifiable to me without sort of, matching that to some, whatever. But they, were their kind of permission, were they to spend a lot of money and a lot of time reconfiguring their system so everyone could have access, that would be possible, right? They do, collect that information. And at this point, I will say, like, it is not easy to access that information. They log that very strenuously, and that's in part because, when I started back in 2006, it was a lot easier to access that information. There were a couple of incidents.
Yeah, it has been interesting speaking to employees who have worked across, let's say, a Google, Facebook, and an Apple. And for say Facebook and Google, they felt were fairly open, and Apple was like Fort Knox when it came to user data, and it's not part of their marketing. But we can spend an hour talking about that. I want to go back to the politics stuff. So Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, caused a bit of a stir in Silicon Valley when he banned employee activism, political activism, within the company. And, I thought about that, and I said, well, we've definitely had like some interesting results from employee activism inside tech companies over the past couple of years. But on the other hand, like, maybe it's better for employees, political energy to be channeled through normal political channels versus, trying to work within their company to have them, make statements. I think about like the energy people could put in, try to work through like the way that the American political system operates, versus, working to get their CEO, to take a political stance or the other. And maybe the energy would be better placed, working through the traditional political system. So I'm curious what you made of the move, and what you sort of think about, how people's energy is best spent.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of questions I have about that framing, because when you think about the traditional, political system, I'm like, are you thinking about it without the voter disenfranchisement that has been part of the far right agenda for 20 years, driven by Karl Rove and others? Or are you thinking about it sort of with that, right? Are you thinking about it before Citizens United, when, kind of corporate donations became corporate speech, and you had huge, millions of billions of dollars of kind of corporate dark money flooding into these campaigns, or before that, right? Like, what conditions of normal politics are we talking about such that, volunteering to get out the vote would be as effective as, organizing for worker power? And I guess that's a question we all have to wrestle with, because I think what we're dealing with right now is a extraordinarily atrophied, if not broken, political system that has, been at the receiving end of legal activism and lobbying and a really organized campaign by the far right for many, many, many years. And, right now we're speaking, I think that the Amy Coney Barrett hearing is happening right now, which could further gut, the last threads of, kind of voter protections that we have. So I don't, again, I want to be really careful about that frame. And I think,
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say that, like, I think these are real issues, but like, it's also like, I don't know, like, if folks don't like the way that the political system is operating, it's one thing to say it's wrong. It's another thing to throw up their hands and say, well, this is, it's kind of broken and we can't fix it. And I also wonder if the energy would be well spent trying to push back against some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah. And I think, part of trying to push back against that would be things like pushing back against the sort of, slush money that these corporate PACs are pushing into far right causes that don't, represent the views of the people who are there, or represent, arguably the best interest of the public. Right. So, again, I think we can't ignore the outsized influence, like vastly orders of magnitude outsized influence that large corporations have in shaping our political system, and the way in which sort of individual goodwill and sort of volunteerism doesn't even, it doesn't even come close to ranking against, the way these companies are able to operate. So, again, this isn't saying give up on the political system, right? Like, I think, try all tools, definitely vote, right? Get your parents to vote, like, do the work. But I think, frankly, I think worker organizing is also politics, right? I think when you look, the Coinbase story, one of the pieces that I often hear missing from this story is that the CEO wrote that, that sort of polemic blog post after he had been challenged by a number of workers who ultimately staged a walkout because he wouldn't say Black Lives Matter. So there was
Hmm.
context already for that, right? And what do you make of a CEO who won't say Black Lives Matter during a time of the unprecedented rise in sort of white supremacy and a kind of veering toward authoritarianism, right? Like that
No
is
doubt.
political.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
I mean that should be an easy one.
yeah,
Um,
it's
but there's more. By the way, I think that there's more to it than just volunteerism. Like people can run for office, they can
yeah,
advocate for laws to be changed. Okay, so you got retaliated against. You left Google. I think Claire Stapleton also left inside
mhm,
Amazon, another company I cover, and spoken with Tim Bray, former Amazon
yeah.
VP, who left because of this. The whistleblowers there were fired, um, uh, and so I wonder what's going to happen now that it seems like most of the I mean, not only you and Claire, but it seems like a good chunk of people who led the walkout are out of Google now. So what's going to happen if the fact that to these movements, if the fact that a lot of people who led them have now left, and maybe people who might take your place probably feel fearful of continuing on given what happened.
Well, happily, there's still a lot of organizing going on at these companies that I'm aware of. I think the good news is that there's a lot of ways to organize with your colleagues that don't involve um, kind of a public onslaught that engages the media, which was very much
Hmm.
part of our strategy. But there are a lot of leaders that people don't know about that were part of that organizing, right? A lot of people who didn't want to, or didn't, for one reason or another, didn't want to take the risk of being sort of public with that, right? And we each made our own choice. But again, I certainly don't think this sort of diminishes the strength of the organizing, and I would caution against sort of equating visibility with
Hmm.
continuity. There's a lot of organizing that's continuing, and as you see with the Coinbase, right? Like we now have tools in our toolbox across tech, like the walkout, right? Like a number of Facebook workers who've sort of whistleblown and written their stories as they leave, that are becoming kind of common sense. And I think that's one of the ways this type of organizing and this type of consciousness, permeates over time. And it's certainly, there's certainly continuity between the organizing that was happening when I was there and what we're seeing now. And I think what we're seeing now is like learning from some of the mistakes that I and others made, right? There's, developing sort of stronger and more precise muscles to continue, to continue this work.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, I covered this a little bit in my book, talking about the run up to your protest action. But what was notable about it was that it engaged. There was always dissent inside Google, but it engaged the outside world and the press in particular in a way that I don't think had happened inside Google
Yeah.
before. Okay, let's take one more quick break and come back for a discussion about AI ethics and politics. And we will be back in just a moment. And we're back here for one final segment with Meredith Whittaker, who is the co-founder of the AI Now Institute. And Meredith, you're one of the leaders in the field of AI ethics. And I feel like we should talk about this because, I think for a lot of people, the term AI ethics has become a bit of a lightning rod where people see it as a way, as a vehicle through which, political views, are potentially injected into the tech companies. And we talked a little bit about conservatives. When they see AI ethics, they say, well, is it your ethics or is it our ethics? Forgive me, but I'm going to, I don't really like his methods, but I found this one slide that James O'Keefe unearthed was interesting. He has this slide talking about how, algorithms are programmed and then media is filtered, through those algorithms, and then people are programmed. I'm sure you've seen the slide. And so I'm just kind of curious what you make of that slide and whether you think that these algorithms are actually programming people.
No, I do not. I find, the entire project he's a part of, extremely problematic and like very, very, very flimsy. Right. And I think
Yeah.
the critique I offered around the social network and this picture of tech as a kind of, almost godlike force that's able to subdue us mere mortals, with the power of its algorithms, like, again, no, that's not what's going on. And again, that, that sort of bolsters some of the rhetoric that is ironically coming from these tech companies themselves that are claiming that, these systems can do a lot of things that they've never been proven to do. So no,
Yeah,
algorithms don't
that was an
program.
internal Google, that was an internal Google slide, I think. So
I
maybe it
well, I would disagree with the person who made it. I
put that.
don't,
Yeah.
again, like I don't spend a lot of time digesting Project Veritas.
Yeah. No, look, I'm not a fan of the methods, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
But like I feel like, yeah, there are moments where it's worth like taking a look at some of the material they unearthed, whether the methods
I mean,
are good or not, and then talk about it.
yeah, I don't like that's. I don't really. I'm less concerned with who said it, although that's definitely something we need to take into consideration. Like that's not true, right? That's
Yeah.
not how these things work. And it's feeding dual narratives, right? That I think the tech companies have one interest in presenting this technology as infallible because it justifies the proliferation of this technology into domains where they are gonna make money, right? And the far right has another interest in presenting these technologies as like scary bogeymen that we need to be very frightened of because it perpetuates a kind of campaign to subdue these companies and ultimately bend them to the will of the far right.
Yeah. And so I'm actually curious about that. So can you talk a little bit about how like the company rhetoric is playing into that far right campaign, and what do you think the far right's goals are? If we talk about like them kind of seizing on to AI ethics as one thing, as a battleground that they're interested in fighting on, what do you think they're aiming to do?
Well, I think I don't see as much of the far right kind of fought around issues of AI in politics, and I also have problems with the term AI ethics because I think it's just almost so broad as to be meaningless, right? But there was organizing we did around a sort of ethics review board that Google put together, in effect to try to sort of pacify some of the dissent around the choices they were making around sort of AI in the military, et cetera, right? And on that review board, they had Kay Coles James, who was the head of the Heritage Foundation, a deeply far right organization that has taken, she personally and the organization as a whole have taken a number of fairly virulent anti-LGBTQ positions, right? Anti-trans positions. And when you look at the way that these AI systems constructed through machine learning work, it is very clear to anyone who works with these systems that, again, they aren't intelligent, right? What they do is they process huge amounts of data, whatever data they have available. And from that data, they build a model of the world. So if you show them a bunch of data about cats, they're going to, here's 20 million pictures of cats, right? They're going to get some picture of what a cat looks like. And then if you show them a picture of a truck, they're going to be like, that's not a cat. You show them a picture of a cat, they're going to be like, I predict that this is a cat, right? Like that's how they work, right? So they're given data from the world we live in, right? That represents our past and our present, and very, kind of irreducibly, right? Like kind of encodes the values that are in that data, right? So these systems very often, and there's now, there's research, Joy Buolamwini, Timnit Gebru, Deborah Raji, others have shown this over and over again, that these systems replicate patterns of racism, patterns of misogyny. They sort of encode these assumptions in, their understanding of the world, because of course their understanding is trained on data that is pulled from that very same world, those very same contexts. So when you're looking at the politics of AI systems, when you're looking at their implications, when you're looking at issues of bias and fairness, and yes, even ethics, you need to be really weighting very heavily the views of people who kind of experience those harms of marginalization. So you're looking at people who understand the dynamics of race and racialization, right? People who understand issues with anti-LGBTQ bias, right? And so a lot of our organizing around these issues was sort of pushing back on the idea that a board like that was suitable to make these decisions, and pushing forward the notion that we really needed to center the voices of people who are most likely to be harmed by these systems.
Yeah, there was that case, that very famous case inside Amazon, where they built this recruiting algorithm, and even when they didn't tell the recruiting algorithm what the gender of the person was, it would look for attributes that would indicate that person was a woman, and then end up removing them from the search. And it ended up becoming so broken, I think Amazon gave up on even rolling it out.
Yeah, that's a classic example, right? And I think, what that also is a pretty interesting diagnostic tool to kind of reflect back the persistent misogyny that was sort of encoded in Amazon's hiring practices, right? So we can also think about these systems as sort of, showing us, some of these uncomfortable and potentially latent issues that are, part of the construction of the data that in this case, the resumes, the hiring, the weighting, the performance reviews, et cetera, that train this algorithm.
Yeah, now there is a field that you are in which looks at these issues, and then you also have the U.S. government, which seems, interested in sort of taking it into its own hands. We're about to see, it seems like, a push from the Department of Justice under Bill Barr to, attack Google in some way. I mean, obviously, there's going to be real antitrust issues that they're looking at, but they're also probably going to be looking at the way that Google treats conservative content. That's at least the previews that we've seen. That's what it seems like it might be. So I wonder, do you worry that like even if the field that you're in does good work, that the government with the will come in with blunt force and end up rolling some of it back or changing it, or actually even in bad faith manipulating the way that these companies treat content and treat algorithms?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, these are political battles, and what the the far right and the sort of proto-fascist government is saying right now is that if you deplatform hate speech, if you deplatform Nazi content, if you deplatform the sort of propaganda arm that we are that we have kind of implemented through these systems, then we are going to come after you, right? That's the there is zero proof that anti-conservative bias exists. In fact, these companies bend over backwards to not enforce their terms of service for people like President Trump, right? But you see that why during the kind of big tech hearings did Jim Johnson and Representative Gertz spend so much time just like kind of bloviating about this, right? They're setting up a narrative that is effectively communicating to these companies, don't touch this content. And I think, again, that gets back to the fact that this is organized, that there's actually, there is money going in to the propagation of this type of content through these networks, right? It's not magic, it's organization and it's funding.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting couple of months ahead as we see sort of first this Department of Justice action, maybe the outcome of what we have seen from the House, subcommittee on antitrust, and then of course the election. Okay, why don't we end with one question? Let's see. So you tweeted today, which will be tomorrow or whatever, a week later by the time this airs, but you said, if you could, an interview question you asked to people is, if you could shut down the internet, would you? So if you could shut down the internet, would you?
Oh, well, one of the things I also tweeted when I tweeted that interview question, which is something I used to ask at Google when I was interviewing people, was that what I was looking for was someone who would actually take that question seriously, would think about, in total, do I think this is sort of a positive or a negative force? And I think, and I would work with people to sort of think through that, right? What would be the reason for shutting it down? What would be the reason for, keeping it on, right? All things considered. And I think my view on this is that, it's going to be really hard to turn these sort of computational network technologies, so like the internet plus everything that's been built on top of these, these original protocols and all of the infrastructure that was built out and is now mainly privately owned to, to carry this content, et cetera, all the devices. It's going to be really hard to sort of repurpose that to good, given the consolidation of power that is right now sort of dominating those infrastructures. And, frankly, given the sort of neoliberal capitalist incentives that are, driving those who dominate these infrastructures. So I think it's worth fighting. I think I'm certainly not, anti-computers or anti-technology, but I think we have to recognize these as questions of power and control, and not questions of the hypothetical benevolent uses of these technologies when, we can look at, what generally actually happens when, people with a certain set of incentives are the ones governing their use and utility.
Yeah, and I think that the good news is right now we're starting to have these conversations in a way that we weren't a couple of years ago. And I think your work, Meredith, is a big reason for it. So we do appreciate it. And it's always great to be able to, talk about this stuff and go deep into it. And hopefully it leads to more and more discussions. Okay, I think that's going to do it for our time. So I just wanted to say thanks everybody out there at the World Summit for AI. We appreciate you tuning in. If you like the podcast, we'll have more of these discussions. We do it every Wednesday. You can go to Big Technology Podcast in your app of choice, and it will hopefully be there. We just got on Stitcher, so we're there too. And for everyone listening, through one of those podcast apps, if this is your first time and you liked it, please hit subscribe. If you're a longtime listener, if you could give us a rating, that would help with discoverability. So we appreciate that. And most of all, thank you, Meredith. It's been great sitting down here and speaking with you about these very important issues. And I hope to continue the conversation. So thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all. Have a great day.